In the first century of the Common Era, in the misty lowlands of what is now eastern England, a child was born into the Iceni, one of the most powerful Celtic tribes of ancient Britannia. We do not know the precise year, nor the exact season, but we know the world she entered. A world of roundhouses and sacred groves, of tribal law and warrior honour, of the deep green silence of an island not yet fully broken by Rome. Her name was Boudica. In the Brythonic tongue of her people, it meant simply victory. She came into a world already trembling at the edges. Roman boots had touched British soil less than a generation before her birth, under the Emperor Claudius, and the great legions were moving steadily inward, absorbing tribe after tribe into the vast machinery of empire. But here, in the heartland of the Iceni, life still ran by older rhythms. Children grew strong on meat and mead, on stories of gods and ancestors, on the discipline of the spear and the wisdom of the Druids. Boudica would have learnt to ride before she could walk steadily. She would have heard the war cries before she understood their words. Celtic society, unlike Rome's, afforded women a remarkable degree of power and agency. Women could own property, lead tribes, fight in battle. A girl of noble birth, and Boudica's birth was noble, would have been trained not merely in the domestic arts, but in leadership, in judgment, in the fierce loyalty that bound a tribe together. We imagine her childhood in firelight, the smell of smoke and pine, the sound of horses at dusk, a mother's hands braiding red hair, a father's voice recounting the names of kings. History gives us no diary, no portrait, no birth record. What it gives us instead is the woman she became. And from that woman, we can trace backwards the outline of a remarkable childhood. Fierce, proud, and utterly fearless. To understand Boudica, you must first understand the Iceni. They were not the savage, painted barbarians that Roman writers delighted in depicting. They were a sophisticated, deeply organized people with a rich material culture, complex governance, and a fierce sense of identity rooted in land, ancestry, and freedom. The Iceni occupied the territory of modern Norfolk and parts of Suffolk and Cambridgeshire, a landscape of wide skies, river valleys, and dense forest. Their hill forts commanded the high ground. Their farms worked the fertile plains. They bred exceptional horses and produced extraordinary metalwork. The golden torques they wore around their necks were not mere ornaments, but declarations of status, wealth, and divine favour. At the head of Iceni society stood the king, advised by nobles, druids, and warriors. But power was not solely masculine. Women held genuine authority. They could inherit, they could lead war bands, they could speak in council. The gods they worshipped, among them Andraste, goddess of victory, were not distant abstractions, but immediate, demanding presences, woven into every aspect of daily life. The druids who served those gods were the tribe's scholars, judges, healers, and historians. Their knowledge was oral, passed through years of rigorous training, preserved in the memory of living people rather than written on parchment. This world had its own grandeur, its own laws, its own beauty. When Roman writers dismissed the Celts as chaotic and undisciplined, they were imposing the values of the forum and the legion onto a civilization that simply organized itself differently. Not worse, merely other. The Iceni had stood apart from the first Roman incursions by striking a client-kingdom arrangement with Rome. They would cooperate, pay tribute, and retain nominal independence in exchange for peace. It was a precarious bargain, a deal made between unequal partners, where one side held all the swords. For a generation, the arrangement held. The Iceni kept their horses, their talks, their gods. They watched the Roman roads creep closer and told themselves that the agreement would endure. They were wrong. In the year 43 of the Common Era, the Emperor Claudius launched the most ambitious military operation Rome had attempted in a generation: the conquest of Britannia. 4 legions, some 40,000 soldiers, crossed the Channel and drove inland, crushing resistance with devastating efficiency. The island that Julius Caesar had twice visited but never held was about to become a Roman province. The conquest was not swift everywhere, nor was it without resistance. In the south and east, some tribes capitulated quickly, recognizing that negotiation offered better odds than battle against the most disciplined military force the ancient world had ever produced. Others fought with extraordinary ferocity. The warrior queen Cartimandua of the Brigantes made alliance with Rome. Caraticus of the Catuvalauni led a prolonged guerrilla resistance before his eventual capture and humiliation in Rome, where, by all accounts, he bore himself with such dignity that even the emperor was moved. The Roman advance reshaped everything it touched. Roads were laid across ancient trackways. Fortresses rose where sacred groves had stood. The taxation system reached into every harvest. Roman governors arrived with vast administrative power and frequently very little patience for the customs and sensitivities of the people they now ruled. For the client kingdoms, those tribes who had chosen accommodation over resistance, the arrangement required constant, humiliating calibration. How much tribute was too much to pay without provoking rebellion at home? How much Roman interference could be tolerated before the warriors demanded action? The Iceni threaded this needle carefully, under their king Prasutagus. He was a pragmatist, a man who understood that open confrontation with Rome meant annihilation. So he kept the peace, paid his taxes, and raised his daughters in a kingdom that was free in name, if not entirely in fact. Beside him, growing into her full authority as queen, stood Boudica. She watched the legions on the horizon. She noted the roads. She felt, as any intelligent, proud person in her position must have felt, the slow tightening of the Roman grip. And she remembered the old stories of what it meant to be free. Boudica became queen of the Iceni through marriage to Prasutagus, but she was no ceremonial consort. Ancient sources, limited and filtered through Roman eyes as they are, consistently describe her as a figure of commanding physical presence and formidable intelligence. Cassius Dio, writing over a century after her death, described her as tall, with a harsh voice and a piercing gaze. Her long red hair falling to her hips, her bearing that of a queen who needed no crown to announce herself. These descriptions come from Rome's perspective, tinged with the Roman anxiety about powerful women that runs through much of ancient writing. But strip away the editorial colouring, and a consistent picture emerges. A woman who led, who decided, who was obeyed. As queen, Boudica would have presided over council, managed alliances with neighbouring tribes, overseen the distribution of resources, arbitrated disputes, and embodied the symbolic unity of the Iceni people. She bore Prasutagus 2 daughters, whose names history has not preserved. A painful silence that speaks to how thoroughly Rome erased what it wished not to remember. The marriage appears to have been a genuine partnership. Prasutagus was politically astute. Boudica was fierce and principled. Together, they managed the impossible tightrope of client kingdom life under Roman rule. Prasutagus made one final act of political calculation before his death. He wrote a will, dividing his kingdom equally between his 2 daughters and the Roman Emperor Nero. He believed, as many client kings before him had believed, that this gesture of goodwill would protect his family and his people. He was fatally wrong. Rome did not recognize the right of Celtic women to inherit kingdoms. Rome did not feel bound by the private wills of client kings. When Prasutagus died, the date is uncertain, likely sometime in the late 50s CE, the Roman procurator, Catus Decianus, moved immediately. What followed was not administration. It was plunder. What Rome did to Boudica and her daughters after the death of Prasutagus was not an accident of policy or a misunderstanding of local custom. It was a deliberate act of domination, designed to make an example, to break the spirit of a proud people, and to make perfectly clear who held power in Britannia. Roman officials seized the Iceni lands as if they were conquered territory rather than a client kingdom. The noble families of the tribe had their estates stripped. Roman soldiers moved through Iceni settlements with the casual brutality of an occupying army that expects no consequences. And then came the act that would ignite a rebellion, the like of which Rome had not faced in a generation. Boudica, the queen, the widow, the woman who had maintained the alliance her husband had spent his reign building, was publicly humiliated by Roman soldiers. Her daughters were taken. The injustice was total and entirely intentional. The procurator, Catus Decianus, almost certainly authorized, or at minimum, permitted these acts. He had misjudged his audience catastrophically. What he understood as the assertion of Roman authority, the Iceni understood as a declaration of war. In Celtic society, the violation of a queen was not merely a crime against a person. It was a crime against the tribe, against the ancestors, against the gods themselves. The warriors who witnessed what was done to Boudica and her daughters did not lower their heads and return to their farms. They went to their weapons. Word spread across the Iceni lands with the speed of wildfire. And it did not stop there. Neighbouring tribes, the Trinovantes, who harboured their own long and bitter grievances against Rome, particularly against the colony at Camulodunum, listened and began to move. Rome had broken a queen. In doing so, it had forged one. The woman who rose from that public humiliation was no longer simply a widow protecting her daughter's inheritance. She was something older and more dangerous. A symbol. And in a world where symbols could move armies, that made her the most powerful person in Britannia. In the year 60 or 61 CE, historians debate the precise date, Boudica raised her standard and the tribes of Britannia answered. The Iceni formed the core of the rebellion, but they were joined by the Trinovantes and elements of several other tribes, all united by grievance, fury, and the towering figure of a red-haired queen on a war chariot. Ancient sources suggest the rebel force numbered in the hundreds of thousands, though Roman writers routinely inflated enemy numbers to magnify their own victories. What is certain is that it was enormous, a Celtic army of extraordinary size and fury, drawn together by a shared sense of outrage and a shared desire for freedom. Boudica addressed her forces before the first march. The speech that Tacitus gives her, the great Roman historian who is one of our primary sources for these events, is almost certainly his own rhetorical composition rather than a verbatim record. But the sentiments ring true. She spoke of stolen lands and violated daughters. She spoke of Roman greed and Roman arrogance. She called upon the goddess Andraste, the Iceni deity of victory, releasing a hare as an omen, and when it ran in a favourable direction, the crowd erupted. Rome's principal military force in Britannia, the governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus and his legions, was far away, campaigning in the west, on the island of Mona, the great Druidic stronghold off the coast of what is now Wales. Britannia's Roman heartland was effectively undefended. Boudica knew it. She moved with speed, with purpose, and with the contained fury of a woman who had been waiting for this moment since the day Roman soldiers laid their hands on her. The first target was Camulodunum, the Roman colony of Colchester, the oldest Roman city in Britain, home of the great temple of Claudius that the Britons regarded as a symbol of eternal servitude. The Iceni marched south, and Camulodunum burned. Camulodunum, modern Colchester, was the jewel of Roman Britain. The first permanent Roman colony on the island, it had been deliberately established on Trinovantian sacred ground, its great temple to the deified Emperor Claudius, built as a monument to Roman permanence and Roman supremacy. For the native Britons who lived in its shadow and were taxed to fund its construction, it was not a symbol of civilization. It was a symbol of everything that had been taken from them. When Boudica's army arrived, the city was almost entirely without military defence. Suetonius Paulinus was in the northwest. The nearest Roman forces were inadequate and disorganised. A desperate message was sent to the procurator Catus Decianus, the same man whose actions had sparked the revolt, and he sent 200 poorly equipped soldiers. It was not enough. The Roman veterans and colonists who sheltered inside the unfinished temple of Claudius held out for 2 days before the end came. Archaeological evidence excavated in Colchester tells a story that words alone cannot fully convey. A layer of red ash, fire debris, lies buried beneath the modern city, the physical signature of a single, catastrophic burning event, datable to precisely this period. Samian pottery, melted glass, charred grain, scorched tile. The city did not merely fall, it was unmade. The 9th Legion Hispana, commanded by Quintus Petilius Cerealis, marched to relieve Camulodunum and was ambushed. Its infantry was annihilated. Only the cavalry escaped. It was a catastrophic Roman defeat, the worst the legions had suffered in Britain since the conquest. For Boudica, it was a signal that the impossible was, in fact, possible. Rome could bleed. The legions could break. Her people, fired by righteous fury and by the momentum of an astonishing victory, pressed on. 2 more cities lay ahead, Londinium and Verulamium. The fires of Camulodunum lit the road to both. Londinium, Roman London, was not yet the grand city it would become in later centuries. In 60 CE, it was a prosperous trading settlement, barely 2 decades old, crowded with merchants, administrators, craftsmen, and the busy apparatus of commercial empire. It sat on the north bank of the Thames, at the point where the river was narrow enough to bridge, wide enough to harbour ocean-going vessels. It was wealthy, strategically vital, and, crucially, almost entirely undefended. Suetonius Paulinus, receiving news of the catastrophe at Camulodunum, made the brutal calculation that all great commanders must sometimes make. He marched his forces to Londinium with all speed, assessed the city's defences, assessed the size of Boudica's approaching host, and made the decision to abandon it. The people who could move, he took with him. Those who could not, the elderly, the infirm, those who refused to believe the army would leave them, he left behind. Boudica's forces arrived, and the city was given to destruction. Like Camulodunum before it, Londinium burned. The archaeological record beneath the modern City of London mirrors what was found in Colchester. That same distinctive layer of red ash, datable to the same moment, containing the same evidence of sudden and total fire. Verulamium, St. Albans, suffered the same fate. 3 cities reduced to ash. Tens of thousands of people dead. The Roman province of Britannia teetered on the edge of collapse. In Rome itself, the Emperor Nero reportedly considered abandoning the island entirely. The scale of Boudica's achievement, in military terms, in psychological terms, in the sheer audacity of what she had accomplished, was without precedent in the history of Roman Britain. She had taken a grief, a humiliation, and a people's long-suppressed rage, and forged it into a force that made the greatest empire on earth flinch. But Suetonius Paulinus was still in the field, and he was choosing his ground. Suetonius Paulinus chose his battlefield with the cold precision of a man who had spent his career fighting in difficult terrain. He selected a narrow defile, a valley flanked by forest, somewhere in the Midlands, the exact location still debated by scholars. What mattered was this: the ground negated Boudica's greatest advantages. Her army was vast, but in a narrow valley it could not deploy its full width. Her numbers could not outflank what the terrain already protected. The Roman force, perhaps 10,000 soldiers, formed a tight line across the narrow ground, the veteran legionaries in their disciplined ranks, auxiliaries on the flanks, cavalry at the wings. Behind them, forest. Before them, the massed fury of the largest British army ever assembled. Behind Boudica's forces, in a decision that would prove disastrous, the wagons carrying the families who had come to watch the expected victory were drawn up in a great arc, blocking any retreat. It was a gesture of certainty, of absolute confidence that the Romans would break and run. Boudica drove along her front line in her chariot, her daughters beside her, one final time, calling to her warriors. Tacitus gives her words of defiance, of justice, of the choice between freedom and slavery. Then the armies met. The Romans held. Against every expectation, against the sheer mass of humanity surging toward them, the Roman line held. Paulinus's soldiers threw their javelins in disciplined volleys, then locked shields and advanced in tight wedge formation, the move for which they had trained their whole lives. The Celtic charge, magnificent and terrible, began to lose its momentum against an immovable wall of shields and short swords. And then it cracked. What followed was a rout. The very wagons drawn up behind the Celtic army became a trap, their own families blocking their escape. The slaughter was catastrophic. Ancient sources speak of 80,000 Britons dead. Whatever the true figure, it was decisive and final. The revolt was over. Boudica did not allow herself to be taken prisoner. On that point, every ancient source agrees, though they differ on the manner of her end. Tacitus says she took poison. Cassius Dio says she fell ill and died. What both agree on is that she chose her own death rather than the alternative: capture, chains, the long walk through Rome in a triumphal procession, the public humiliation that Rome reserved for those who had dared to defy it. She was a queen to the last. Suetonius Paulinus was later recalled to Rome. His brutal reprisals in the aftermath of the revolt were judged excessive even by Roman standards, threatening the very economic viability of the province he was supposed to govern. Catus Decianus, whose actions had lit the fire, fled to Gaul and vanishes from history. The province of Britannia survived, was stabilized, and endured for 3.5 more centuries. The ash layer beneath Colchester, London, and St Albans endured longer still. Boudica herself was largely forgotten in the written record for centuries. She appears in Tacitus, written around 117 CE, and in Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century. Then, silence, for more than 1,000 years. She was rediscovered during the Tudor period, when the newly Protestant English found in her story a useful mirror. A British woman resisting a continental empire felt resonant in an age of Spanish threat and Elizabethan nationalism. By the Victorian era, she had been fully absorbed into imperial iconography. A bronze statue of her chariot was erected beside the Houses of Parliament in London, commissioned by Prince Albert, unveiled in 1902. The supreme irony. A queen who fought against empire made the symbol of one. But that reduction does not hold. Boudica was not a symbol. She was a person, a mother, a widow, a leader, a woman who looked at what Rome had done to her family and her people and said, "No further." She did not win, but she made Rome afraid. And across 20 centuries, that fear has echoed into something that sounds very much like legend.